An aging widow adopts a stray dog, only to learn it's the reincarnation of her childhood sweetheart. Margaret Lancaster had never meant to bring another living being into her quiet, carefully ordered life again. Not after Edward. Not after 52 years of marriage ended with her holding his hand as he slipped away, leaving nothing but silence in the three-bedroom colonial they'd spent their lives filling with gentle routines and comfortable silences. That was 18 months ago. Now, at 73, Margaret moved through her days like a ghost haunting her own life. Monday was grocery shopping at Pearson's Market, where she selected single portions of everything and pretended not to notice the pity in the cashier's eyes. Tuesday was the library, where she exchanged mysteries she barely remembered reading for new ones that would blur together just the same. Wednesday was coffee with Helen, the only friend who hadn't given up on her. The rest of the week stretched before her in identical squares of emptiness, marked only by the ticking of the grandfather clock Edward had lovingly restored before his heart had begun to fail. This particular Thursday in October shouldn't have been different from any other. The morning air carried the first genuine bite of autumn, making Margaret pull her cardigan tighter as she walked the 3 blocks to Madeline's bakery. This weekly indulgence, a single almond croissant and small coffee, was one of the few rituals she maintained purely for herself. She sat at her usual table by the window, watching fallen leaves dance across the sidewalk. The coffee warmed her hands more than her insides, and the pastry remained mostly untouched, flakes of crust scattered across the small plate like memories she couldn't quite piece back together. That's when she first saw him. Thin, matted fur stretched over jutting ribs, one ear torn, eyes that somehow managed to look both wary and hopeful. The stray dog limped across the street, narrowly avoiding a delivery van before collapsing in a patch of weak sunlight near the bakery's entrance. Margaret had never been particularly fond of dogs. Edward had been allergic, and their neat, organized life had never had room for the chaos of a pet. Yet something about this pathetic creature tugged at something long dormant inside her chest. "That poor thing's been hanging around for days," Madeline said, appearing beside Margaret's table with a fresh pot of coffee. "Animal control's been called twice, but he always disappears before they arrive." Margaret watched as the dog rested his muzzle on his paws, those eyes, deep amber, almost golden, seeming to look directly at her through the window glass. "He won't last another week if someone doesn't help him," Madeline added, before moving to the next table. Margaret sat very still, feeling something crack inside her, a hairline fracture in the careful wall she'd built around her grief. Without making a conscious decision, she wrapped the remaining croissant in a napkin and walked outside. The dog raised his head as she approached, his body tensing as if preparing to flee. Margaret stopped several feet away and slowly knelt, her knees protesting the movement. She extended her hand with the croissant. "It's all right," she said, her voice rusty from disuse. "I won't hurt you." The dog's nostrils flared, scenting the offering, but he remained frozen. Margaret placed the croissant on the ground and backed away. Only then did the animal inch forward, snatching the pastry with surprising gentleness before retreating to a safe distance. He didn't devour it as she expected, but ate slowly, methodically, those amber eyes never leaving her face. Something about those eyes. They seemed almost human in their intelligence, in the way they appeared to see through her careful composure to the loneliness beneath. Margaret straightened, wincing at the stiffness in her joints. "Well, that's that then," she murmured, turning to leave. Behind her, a soft whine. When she looked back, the dog had taken a single step toward her, his tail giving one tentative wag. Margaret felt her breath catch. In that moment, a memory surfaced, so sharp and sudden it almost hurt, of another pair of amber eyes from long ago. A boy with summer-tanned skin and a crooked smile. William Thornfield. Her first love, before life and circumstance and familial expectations had pulled them in different directions. Before Edward, before the sensible life she'd chosen instead of the passionate one she'd dreamed of. She hadn't thought of William in decades. Why now? The dog whined again, limping another step closer. "I can't," Margaret whispered. "I'm sorry." She walked away quickly, not looking back, ignoring the hollow feeling expanding in her chest. That night, rain lashed against the windows of Margaret's empty house. She sat in Edward's recliner. She still thought of it as his, though she'd been the only one to sit in it for months now, listening to the storm and trying to focus on her mystery novel. The words swam before her eyes, meaningless black marks on white paper. All she could see were those amber eyes, that broken body huddled in the rain. "This is ridiculous," she told the empty room. "Absolutely ridiculous." And yet, at 11:42 p.m., Margaret Lancaster found herself pulling on Edward's old raincoat over her nightgown, slipping her feet into garden boots, and taking the emergency flashlight from the drawer in the kitchen. The storm had intensified, rain coming down in sheets that the flashlight's beam barely penetrated. Margaret hobbled the 3 blocks to the bakery, feeling water seep into her boots and plaster her thin white hair to her skull. The bakery stood dark and shuttered. The small alcove where the dog had been was empty. "Of course," she muttered, feeling equal parts relief and disappointment. She was about to turn back when her flashlight caught a flicker of movement in the narrow alley beside the building. There, wedged between a dumpster and the brick wall, the dog lay curled into a tight ball, shivering violently. Even in the dim light, Margaret could see he looked worse than before, his breathing shallow and rapid. Without hesitation, she shrugged out of Edward's coat and stepped carefully toward the animal. "I'm probably making a terrible mistake," she said softly, "but I can't leave you here to die." The dog raised his head slightly, those amber eyes finding hers through the darkness and rain. He made no sound, no movement, as she gently wrapped the coat around his trembling body and lifted him into her arms. He weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones and wet fur that smelled of garbage and sickness. The walk home was slow and painful. Margaret's back and arms screamed in protest, but she clutched the dog to her chest, murmuring nonsense words of comfort with each labored step. Inside her house, she laid him gently on the kitchen floor and stood dripping and shivering herself, suddenly uncertain. What did one do with a half-dead stray dog at midnight? She found an old blanket in the linen closet and arranged it in a corner of the kitchen, away from drafts. After filling a bowl with water and another with small pieces of leftover chicken from yesterday's solitary dinner, she carefully transferred the dog to his makeshift bed. "Just for tonight," she told him firmly. "In the morning we'll find someone who knows about dogs." The animal made no response, his eyes already closed, his breathing still too fast. Margaret hesitated, then stroked one finger gently over his wet head. "Please don't die," she whispered, surprised by the catch in her voice. "Not tonight. Not here." She changed into dry clothes and made herself a cup of tea, then settled into a kitchen chair where she could watch the sleeping dog. She'd just stay awake a little while, she told herself, to make sure he was all right. Margaret jerked awake at dawn, her neck stiff from sleeping upright in the kitchen chair. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember why she was there. Then her eyes fell on the blanket in the corner. Empty. Her heart sank. Had the dog died during the night? Had she imagined bringing him home? A soft clicking sound made her turn. The dog stood in the doorway to the living room watching her. He was still painfully thin, his fur matted and dirty, but he stood steadily on all 4 legs, the terrible weakness of the night before somehow diminished. "You're alive," Margaret said, relief washing through her. The dog's tail gave a single wag. He limped toward her, stopping a respectful distance away, those amber eyes fixed on her face. Margaret saw that he had drunk some water but hadn't touched the chicken. "Not hungry?" she asked, then felt foolish for speaking to him as if he could understand. Yet something in the tilt of his head, the intelligent focus of his gaze, made her continue. "Well, we need to get you to a veterinarian, and I should call animal control. Someone might be looking for you." At the words animal control, the dog's ears flattened and he backed away. "You understand me?" Margaret whispered, not quite a question. The dog blinked slowly, then deliberately walked to her side and leaned gently against her leg. Margaret's hand moved of its own accord to touch the matted fur. The moment her fingers made contact, a jolt went through her, not physical but emotional, like the sudden reconnection of a circuit long broken. Images flashed through her mind, a creek lined with willow trees, the sound of a boy's laughter, the feeling of a hand holding hers. William, the summer they turned 16. The last summer before everything changed. She jerked her hand away, heart pounding. The dog looked up at her, those amber eyes, William's eyes, patient and knowing. "I'm losing my mind," Margaret said aloud. "Grief and loneliness and old age, that's all this is?" But when she reached for the phone to call the vet, her hands were shaking. "Doctor." Cooper's small veterinary practice opened at 8. By 7:45, Margaret had coaxed the dog into Edward's old Buick, where he sat primly in the passenger seat as if he'd ridden in cars all his life. "I found this stray," she explained to the young receptionist. "He seems to be injured and She stopped, suddenly unsure how to explain her midnight rescue mission. The receptionist smiled. "Dr. Cooper can fit you in. We always make time for good Samaritans." In the examination room, the dog allowed Dr. Cooper, a woman half Margaret's age with kind eyes and capable hands, to examine him without protest. He only flinched once when she checked his injured back leg. "Well, Mrs. Lancaster, your friend here has been through quite an ordeal," Dr. Cooper said finally. "He's malnourished, has a sprained hind leg, some infected cuts, and a moderate case of heartworm that we'll need to treat. But nothing that can't be mended with proper care." Margaret nodded, feeling strangely relieved. "So he'll recover? If someone were to take him in?" Dr. Cooper smiled. "With good food, medication, and a little love, he'll be a different dog in a few months." She hesitated. "He doesn't have a microchip, and judging by his condition, he's been on his own for quite some time. We can contact the shelter, but—" The veterinarian didn't need to finish her sentence. Margaret knew what happened to older dogs at overcrowded shelters. "I'll keep him," she heard herself say, "just until he's well enough to find a proper home." The dog's tail thumped against the examination table. Dr. Cooper's smile widened. "I think he's already found one. Do you have a name for him?" Margaret looked into those familiar amber eyes. "Will," she said softly. "His name is Will." The first week with Will upended everything about Margaret's carefully ordered existence. Her spotless house now contained a dog bed in the living room, though Will spent most nights sleeping on the rug beside her bed, food and water bowls in the kitchen, and an assortment of medications to be administered at specific times. There were frequent short walks as his strength improved, careful baths to clean his matted fur, and endless vacuuming of dog hair. Yet, for all the disruption, Margaret found herself moving through her days with a strange new energy. For the first time since Edward's death, she had a reason to get up in the morning beyond mere habit. Someone needed her. More than that, someone was happy to see her, greeting each morning with a soft whine of welcome and those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand her every word. "You're a very strange dog, Will," she told him on the 7th day, as they sat together on the back porch. October was yielding to November, but the afternoon sun still held enough warmth to make sitting outside pleasant. Will's head rested on her knee, his fur, now clean and beginning to fill out, gleaming copper in the sunlight. "Sometimes I think you understand everything I say." She stroked his head, no longer alarmed by the memories that sometimes flickered through her mind at his touch. "And sometimes I think I must be going senile, imagining such things." Will sighed contentedly, pressing closer. "I had a dream about William last night," Margaret continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The first time in, it must be 50 years. We were at the creek where we used to meet, and he was telling me something important, but I couldn't hear the words." Will lifted his head, those amber eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "It's silly," she said, looking away. "William Thornfield has probably been dead for years. And even if he isn't, he certainly wouldn't remember a summer romance from 1967. Will placed one paw on her arm, a gesture so deliberately human that Margaret felt that same jolt of recognition. "Stop that," she said sharply. "You're a dog. Just a dog I rescued because I was lonely." Will removed his paw but continued to watch her, his expression, and dogs did not have expressions, Margaret reminded herself, somehow sad and patient at once. That night Margaret dreamed of William again. They were no longer teenagers but their present selves, she as she was now, an old woman with thin white hair and arthritic hands, he as she imagined he might have become, an old man with those same amber eyes and a weathered face. "I've been waiting for you to remember, dream," William said, his voice exactly as she remembered, with that slight lift at the end of sentences that had always made it sound like he was asking a question, even when he wasn't. "Remember what?" she asked. "Your promise." Margaret woke with a start, her heart pounding. Will stood beside her bed, whining softly, his paw resting on her arm. "It was just a dream," she told him, her voice shaking. "Just a dream." But as she lay awake for the rest of the night, Will's head resting heavily against her side, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important, something right in front of her. The next day was Wednesday, coffee with Helen. Margaret considered canceling. What would Helen think of her rescuing a stray dog? Helen, whose immaculate condo didn't allow pets, who complained about dog walkers letting their animals near her prized roses. But Margaret had never missed their weekly coffee in 18 months, not even in the dark days right after Edward's funeral. So at precisely 10 a.m. she found herself at the coffee mill, Will lying politely at her feet. She'd brought his leash, of course, but discovered early in their walks that he stayed closer without it than many dogs did with one. Helen was late, unusual for a woman who scheduled her life in 15-minute increments. When she finally arrived, her carefully arranged expression told Margaret she had news she thought required delicate handling. "Margaret," Helen said, settling into her chair and eyeing Will with raised eyebrows. "You got a dog?" "Not exactly," Margaret replied, suddenly defensive. "I found him. He was sick. I'm just fostering him until he's well." Helen nodded, clearly unconvinced. "Well, it's good you're getting out more. In fact, that's what I wanted to talk to you about." She took a deep breath. "Do you remember Thomas Wilson? His wife Elaine was in our garden club before she passed." Margaret vaguely recalled a quiet man with silver hair who had picked up his wife from meetings but rarely spoke. "He asked if you might like to have dinner with him," Helen continued, "just as friends, of course. He's been alone for 3 years now, and when I mentioned you at Bridge Club, he seemed quite interested." Margaret felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "You're trying to set me up?" "Not set you up," Helen backpedaled. "Just introduce two people who might enjoy each other's company. It's been over a year, Margaret. Edward wouldn't want you to be alone forever." At her feet, Will growled, a low, almost inaudible sound. "Thank you, but no," Margaret said firmly. "I'm not interested in dating." Helen sighed. "It's not dating. It's dinner. Conversation with someone who understands what you're going through." She hesitated. "We're all worried about you, Margaret. Living alone in that big house, barely seeing anyone." "I'm fine," Margaret insisted. "I have Will now, and It's a dog, Margaret." Helen interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "Not a person. Not a replacement for human connection." Something inside Margaret, something that had been bending and stretching since the night she'd brought Will home, finally snapped. "I know it's a dog, Helen," she said, her voice low and tight. "I haven't lost my mind. But for the first time since Edward died, I don't dread waking up in the morning. So forgive me if I'm not rushing to have dinner with Thomas Wilson just because you and the Bridge Club think I should." Helen looked stricken. "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant," Margaret said, already gathering her purse. "And I appreciate the concern. But I'm not ready." She stood, Will immediately rising beside her. "I think I'll skip coffee today. Call you next week?" Without waiting for an answer, Margaret walked out, Will keeping perfect pace at her side. She didn't go straight home. Instead, her feet carried her automatically toward Willow Creek Park, a place she hadn't visited in years. It had been different then, not a manicured public park, but a wild stretch of land on the edge of town, with the creek running through it and willow trees lining the banks, where she and William had spent that last golden summer. Will seemed to know exactly where they were going, trotting ahead confidently along paths Margaret half remembered. When they reached the creek, tamed now with concrete banks but still flowing, Will led her to a particular willow tree, older and larger than she remembered but unmistakably the same one. Their tree. Margaret sank onto a bench that hadn't existed 60 years ago, her legs suddenly weak. "How did you know?" she whispered. Will sat before her, those amber eyes steady and patient. "This is insane," Margaret said. He can't be." But the memories were surfacing now, unstoppable. William's laugh, the feel of his hand in hers, the promises they'd made under this very tree. "The last day," she said softly, "before my family moved away, we were sitting right here and William gave me his mother's ring. Said when we were old enough he'd find me wherever I went." Will whined softly, inching closer. "But my father found the ring," Margaret continued, the pain of the memory still fresh after all these years. "He was so angry, said no son of the town drunk was good enough for his daughter. He made me write a letter, telling William I couldn't see him again, that it had just been a summer romance." Tears she hadn't shed in decades filled her eyes. "I never sent it, but I never contacted him either when we moved. I was 17 and scared and weak." Will rested his muzzle on her knee. "Edward was kind and steady and safe," she whispered. "My parents approved, and I did love him in my way. We had a good life together. But sometimes I'd dream of amber eyes and wonder." A jogger passed, giving her an odd look, an old woman crying while talking to her dog. Margaret wiped her eyes. "This is absurd," she said more firmly. "You're a dog, not my reincarnated first love. That only happens in stories, not real life." Will tilted his head, giving her an unmistakable look of challenge. "Fine," Margaret said. "If you're really William, prove it. Tell me something only he would know." Will stood, backing away several paces. Then he began to dig near the base of the willow tree, his movements deliberate and focused. Margaret watched in bewilderment as he excavated a small hole, then looked up at her expectantly. "You want me to look?" she asked. Will barked once, the first time she'd heard him make the sound. Margaret knelt painfully beside the hole, reaching in with trembling fingers. Her hand closed around something small and metallic. When she withdrew it, dirt crumbling away, she found herself holding a tarnished silver ring with a small blue stone, exactly like the one William had given her 60 years ago, the one her father had thrown away. "This is impossible," she whispered, her voice breaking. "How?" Will pressed his nose to her hand, and this time when the memories came, Margaret didn't pull away. They washed over her in a flood, William returning to their spot after she'd moved away, burying the duplicate ring his mother had given him as a keepsake, his promise to wait for Margaret to return. The decades that followed, a life lived without her, a death 5 years ago after a long illness, his final thoughts of the girl under the willow tree, and then darkness, followed by new awareness, a purpose, a search, and finally finding her. Margaret sank fully to the ground, her arms around Will's neck, her tears dampening his fur. "William?" she whispered. "Oh, William, you came back for me." William pressed closer, his solid warmth the only thing anchoring her as the world tilted and reshaped itself around this impossible truth. They stayed like that, woman and dog, beneath the willow tree where a boy and girl had once promised forever, until the afternoon light began to fade and the November chill crept into Margaret's bones. "We should go home," she finally said, her voice hoarse from crying. She slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as if it had been waiting for her all along. "We have a lot to talk about." Living with the knowledge that her dog contained the soul of her first love changed everything and nothing in Margaret's daily life. Will was still a dog, unable to speak, requiring walks and food and medication for his heartworm. But now when he watched her with those amber eyes, she felt not just seen but known in a way she hadn't been in decades. "I still don't understand how this is possible," she told him that evening as they sat together in the living room. The television played a documentary neither was watching. "Or why, after all this time, you'd want to find me. I abandoned you, William. I chose the safe path." Will rested his head on her lap, his eyes conveying what words couldn't. Forgiveness, understanding, acceptance of the choices a frightened 17-year-old girl had made. "I should have been braver," Margaret whispered, stroking his ear. "I've thought about you over the years, you know. Especially when things with Edward were difficult." Will's eyes questioned. "Oh, not bad difficult," Margaret clarified. "Edward was a good man, kind, responsible, but there was always something missing, a spark, the feeling that he saw all of me, even the messy parts." She smiled sadly. "The feeling I had with you that summer," Will sighed, a sound so human it made Margaret's breath catch. "I'm going senile," she said, but without conviction. "Talking to a dog as if he's my reincarnated boyfriend? Helen would have me committed." Will huffed, clearly amused. "Well, she would," Margaret insisted. "And I can't exactly explain, can I? Oh, Helen, meet my dog. He's actually William Thornfield, my first love. He's come back to fulfill a promise from 1967. That would go over well." Will lifted his head, suddenly alert. "What?" Margaret asked. Will stood, walking purposefully to the bookshelf where Edward's old photo albums were neatly arranged. He nosed at a particular volume, the one containing pictures from before their marriage. "You want me to get that?" Margaret asked, bemused. Will barked once, yes. She retrieved the album and sat back down, opening it on her lap. Will immediately pawed at a specific page. There, in a faded color photograph from a community picnic in 1968, Edward stood with a group of young men from the bank where he'd worked. And slightly to the side, almost at the edge of the frame, was another young man with tousled hair and a half-smile. "William?" Margaret breathed, her finger tracing the blurry figure. "You knew Edward?" Will nudged her hand to turn the page. Several more group photos showed the same pattern. Edward centered with colleagues, William somewhere on the periphery. Not a friend, clearly, but an acquaintance. "I never noticed?" Margaret whispered. "All these years these pictures were here and I never saw you in them." Will's eyes held an emotion that transcended his canine form, a deep sadness tinged with acceptance. "You watched me with him," Margaret realized. "You stayed in this town and watched me build a life with Edward." Will lowered his head in confirmation. Did you ever marry?" she asked suddenly. Will hesitated, then shook his head. "Oh, William." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. "You shouldn't have waited. You deserved happiness." Will nudged her hand insistently, his message clear. He had made his choice, just as she had made hers. The days grew shorter as November deepened toward December. Will gained weight, his coat becoming thick and lustrous, the copper color reminding Margaret of William's hair that last summer. His limp gradually disappeared as the sprain healed. Only the heartworm treatment remained, requiring careful monitoring and limited exercise. Margaret found herself talking to him constantly, not the one-sided baby talk of a typical pet owner, but real conversations. She told him about her life with Edward, about their son James, who lived in Seattle with his wife and visited twice a year, about the teaching career she'd abandoned when James was born, about the quiet compromises and small contentments that had filled her days. And somehow, through his expressive eyes, attentive ears, and occasionally deliberately placed paws, William communicated back. Not in words, but in a language they were creating together. Part memory, part intuition, part the inexplicable connection that had survived death itself to bring them back to each other. "I called James today," she told Will one evening in early December as they walked slowly through the neighborhood, lights from early Christmas decorations reflecting on the light dusting of snow. "I told him about you." Will glanced up, questioning. "Well, the simplified version," Margaret amended with a small smile, "that I'd adopted a dog. He was surprised, but pleased, I think. He's been worried about me being alone," Will huffed, seeming satisfied. "He's coming for Christmas," Margaret continued, "with Susan and the grandchildren. They usually stay at a hotel, but this year they're staying with me." She hesitated. "It's the first time since Edward. I haven't felt up to hosting before now." Will pressed lightly against her leg, his way of offering support. "I think you're helping me be brave," Margaret said softly. "Or remember how to be brave? I was once. With you." They turned onto their street, the familiar sight of her house coming into view. The porch light cast a warm glow against the gathering darkness. "I've been thinking," Margaret said, her breath clouding in the cold air. "This can't be permanent, this arrangement." She gestured at his canine form. "You can't spend the rest of your life, this life, as my pet. It's not right." Will stopped walking, his gaze intense. "You came back to fulfill your promise," Margaret continued, her voice unsteady. "To find me? And you have. But William, I'm an old woman now. The life I have left is short. You should have a chance at a full life, with a family who can give you decades, not just a few years." Will growled, a sound of clear disagreement. "Don't be stubborn," Margaret said, her throat tight with unshed tears. "I'm trying to do the right thing. For you." Will sat down firmly on the sidewalk, refusing to move, his message unmistakable. He wasn't going anywhere. "William Thornfield," Margaret said, her voice breaking on his name. "I already lost you once because I wasn't brave enough to fight for what I wanted. Don't make me lose you again because I'm trying to be noble." Will stood and pressed his entire body against her legs, nearly knocking her over. The message was clear. She wasn't going to lose him. Not this time. Margaret knelt, ignoring the cold seeping through her pants, and buried her face in his fur. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay. We stay together. For whatever time we have." Back at home, as she prepared for bed, Margaret found herself humming, a tune she hadn't thought of in decades. The song that had played the night of their final meeting under the willow tree. "Our song?" she said aloud, surprised. "I'd forgotten until now." Will, curled on the rug beside her bed, thumped his tail. Margaret sat on the edge of the mattress, looking down at him. "It's all coming back. Things I haven't let myself remember for so long." She twisted the ring on her finger, William's ring, which she now wore openly, no longer caring what Helen or anyone else might think. "I think maybe I needed to forget to survive," she said softly. "To be Edward's wife, James's mother? I had to put away the girl who ran barefoot to meet a boy by the creek." Will rested his chin on the edge of the bed, his eyes holding hers. "But I don't need to forget anymore," Margaret continued, a revelation unfolding even as she spoke. "Edward is gone. James is grown. And you, You've come back to remind me of who I was before, who I might still be. Will's tail thumped harder. I think that's why you're here, Margaret said, wonder in her voice. Not just to fulfill your promise, but to help me remember mine, to myself. That night, Margaret dreamed of dancing, not as they had been, teenagers swaying awkwardly to a distant radio, but as they might have been. Margaret in her 70s, her white hair styled elegantly, in a dress that flowed as she moved. William as he would have been, tall and distinguished with those same amber eyes crinkled at the corners, leading her confidently across a polished floor. She woke smiling, with a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in years. Will was already awake, watching her. "Good morning," she said, realizing she meant it. Over the next weeks, as Christmas approached, something subtle but profound shifted in Margaret. She began to take greater care with her appearance, styling her hair instead of simply pulling it back. She unearthed colorful scarves and jewelry from the back of her closet. She called old friends from her teaching days, accepting an invitation to a holiday luncheon she would have declined a month earlier. She also began to leave small improvements to her house, repainting the guest room, ordering new towels for the bathroom James and his family would use, putting up Christmas decorations for the first time since Edward's death. "It's not that I've forgotten Edward," she explained to Will as they hung lights around the front windows. "But I think I've been confusing grief with loyalty, as if moving forward somehow betrayed his memory." Will, sitting attentively nearby, tilted his head. "I know you understand," Margaret said, climbing carefully down from the stepladder. "You watched over me all those years, wanting me to be happy even if it was with someone else." Will blinked slowly in acknowledgement. "I think," Margaret said, sitting beside him on the couch to admire their handiwork, "Edward would want the same for me, not to forget him, but to live fully with whatever time I have left." She smiled, running her fingers through the thick fur at Will's neck. "And I intend to, now that you've reminded me how." Christmas arrived with a snowstorm that blanketed the town in pristine white. James, Susan, and their children, Emily, 15, and Michael, 12, arrived mid-afternoon on the 23rd, their car loaded with luggage and presents. "Mom, you look wonderful," James said as he hugged her, genuine surprise in his voice. Margaret knew what he meant. The last time he'd seen her, she'd been pale and withdrawn, moving through the rituals of their visit like a woman underwater. Now her cheeks had color, her eyes were bright, and she greeted them with genuine enthusiasm. "And this must be Will," Susan said, kneeling to greet the dog who stood politely at Margaret's side. "He's beautiful, Grandma," Emily said, her initial teenage reticence melting at the sight of Will's intelligent face. "Can I pet him?" "Of course," Margaret said. "He's very gentle." Will suffered the children's attention with dignified patience, allowing Michael to check if his paws were really as big as they looked, and Emily to examine the notch in his ear where it had been torn. "Did you rescue him, Grandma?" Emily asked. Margaret exchanged a glance with Will. "In a way," she said, "though sometimes I think he rescued me." That evening, after a dinner more elaborate than any Margaret had prepared since Edward's death, they gathered in the living room. Michael and Emily persuaded their grandmother to play board games, filling the house with laughter that had been absent for too long. Will lay in the center of it all, his eyes tracking the proceedings with unmistakable contentment. Later, when the children had gone to bed, James found his mother in the kitchen, making hot chocolate the old-fashioned way, with real milk and chocolate slowly melting on the stove. "You seem different, Mom," he said, leaning against the counter beside her. "Happier." Margaret stirred the chocolate thoughtfully. "I am," she admitted. "It took me a while to find my way back to myself." "The dog helps?" James asked. Margaret smiled, glancing at Will, who lay at the kitchen doorway, ever watchful. "More than I can explain," she said. "He reminds me of someone I knew a long time ago. Someone who showed me a different kind of life might be possible." James looked confused but didn't press. "Well, whoever he reminds you of, I'm grateful. It's good to see you living again, not just existing." Margaret reached out to squeeze her son's hand. "I'm sorry if I worried you. Grief takes its own time, I suppose. But yes, I'm living now." Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, sunlight turning the snow into a field of diamonds. They opened presents around the tree, Will receiving his own small pile of gifts, a plush bed from James and Susan, a selection of toys from the children, and from Margaret, a handsome leather collar with a tag engraved with a simple W. "For when we go out," she explained as she fastened it around his neck. "So everyone knows you belong somewhere. To someone," Will held impossibly still as she secured the collar, his amber eyes never leaving her face. Later, while Susan supervised the children trying out their new sleds in the backyard and James napped on the couch, Margaret took Will for their afternoon walk. The neighborhood was quiet, most people inside celebrating with their families. They walked slowly through the fresh snow toward the park. "I have another gift for you," Margaret said as they reached the willow tree, their tree. "But it's not something I can wrap." Will sat attentively watching her. Margaret took a deep breath, her words forming clouds in the cold air. "I've decided to write our story," she said. "Not just that summer, but all of it, including this impossible, wonderful second chance. I was a teacher, not a writer, but I think our story deserves to be told." Will's tail swept an arc in the snow. "I don't know if anyone will believe it," Margaret continued. "They'll probably think it's fiction, or that I've gone senile." She smiled. "But you and I will know the truth." Will stood and pressed against her legs, a gesture that had become his way of expressing agreement, support, love. "There's more," Margaret said, her voice softening. "I've been thinking about what happens when my time comes." Will went very still. "I know it's not something you want to consider," Margaret acknowledged, "but I'm 73, William. Whether it's 5 years or 15 eventually." Will whined, the sound conveying distress. "Listen," Margaret said gently, kneeling despite the cold to look directly into his eyes. "I've made arrangements, in my will, for you to go to a family with children, with years ahead of them. People who will love you and give you the full life you deserve." Will turned his head away, refusing to meet her gaze. "William," Margaret said firmly now, "you found me across death itself. You fulfilled your promise. When my time comes, I need you to promise me you'll let go. That you'll embrace the life you have, not waste it grieving for me." Slowly, reluctantly, Will turned back to her, his amber eyes shining with what could only be tears. "Promise me," Margaret whispered, "as I should have promised you all those years ago, that whatever happens, whatever separates us, we'll each live our lives fully before we meet again." For a long moment, Will didn't move. Then, with deliberate care, he placed his paw directly over the ring on Margaret's finger, a gesture so explicitly human it took her breath away. "A promise." Margaret wrapped her arms around his neck, holding him close as snowflakes began to fall again, dusting both woman and dog with a veil of white. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding me, for showing me it's never too late for a second chance." Will pressed closer, his solid warmth a tether in a world where, Margaret now knew, wonders were possible. Where love could transcend death itself, and an aging widow could discover that life still held magic, if only she were brave enough to embrace it. As they walked home through the gathering dusk, Margaret's heart felt lighter than it had in decades. Ahead lay Christmas dinner with her family, the new year, and beyond that, a future she no longer feared but welcomed, with William at her side, in whatever form their love now took. For some promises, Margaret had learned, were meant to be kept, no matter how impossible they seemed, and some journeys, however long delayed, would always find their way home.